Welcome everybody. Welcome to More Than Just Habitat Bank, building a new investment model for people and nature in Plymouth. My name is Victoria Bradford Keegan. I work for the National Trust on our Urban Green Space programme. I'm delighted to be hosting today's webinar, where I'll be joined by a host of colleagues and friends from Plymouth City Council, Finance Earth, and also from the National Trust as well. Welcome back if you joined us yesterday for the other session, also looking at habitat banking from the kind of strategic perspective, and to get a glimpse into the politician elected member mindset and thinking about habitat banking. If you didn't join us yesterday and you're thinking, oh gosh, I missed out, don't worry, you didn't. The sessions were recorded and we'll be making both the slides and those recordings available on our microsite shortly. Today's session will be slightly different, so you're not in for a repeat. More than slightly different, actually. You're not in for a repeat. If you did join us, we'll be looking much more at the detail of the habitat banking journey that Plymouth City Council and partners has been on, and also looking at some of the resources and support that both this project and other projects have resulted in, which will be available to you. So we'll come back to that later. Although I would just like to say a really big thank you to Natural England, who have made this webinar and the microsite possible today. With their funding has made that possible, so thank you very much. And to the funders of the work that you're going to hear about today, the work in Plymouth was funded through two different programs. First wave through the Future Parks Accelerator, so with thanks to Heritage Fund, National Trust and Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities in that first wave, and then with thanks to Natural England, DEFRA Environment Agency through the Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund, who funded the second wave of that, and also a supplementary or additional project that helped produce the resources that you'll hear about today. I'm going to hand straight over to the Plymouth team, and I think in particular to Kat Deeney, who's going to start us off.
Thank you, Victoria, and hello everyone. I'm Kat Deeney. I'm Head of Environmental Planning at Plymouth City Council, and I'm just going to set the scene before we move into some of the details. So for those of you who were here yesterday, sorry, you might have heard some of this. And if you want a longer understanding of how we got to this stage and our strategic approach, then please do go back and watch yesterday's session. So really, this is just to kind of give you the context of how we ended up developing a habitat bank. It wasn't something that was an idea overnight, but where we started with is Plymouth City Council, like many other local authorities, have got numerous plans and ambitions around not only net zero, but also things like our Plymouth Charter, which are around social impacts of our growth and development, but also a number of nature targets. And we've got some really clear strategic priorities linked to those around how we mitigate for climate change, particularly around flood risk. As you can see, we're at Ocean City, but we also get a lot of issues with surface water flooding. We want to conserve and enhance our natural assets. We want people to be able to engage and access nature. We have high levels of deprivation and inactivity that we want to tackle. But to do all this and increase our ambition, we need a sustainable revenue stream for all of our green and blue assets. And as any of you who work in local authority knows, that's a real challenge. So we've been working with our delivery frameworks. What's very clear is we do not want to, thank you on the slides, do something completely outside of what's going on in the city. It's very important that the work we're doing that has led to the Habitat Bank is delivered in line with delivery frameworks for our place. So it becomes a place-based initiative, not an on-the-side environmental initiative. So this is our city green spaces. These have all been designated and allocated in our joint local plan. So we've put our green spaces There's a level importance to our housing and our employment in all our planning documents. And what it does show is that we've got investment opportunities within the city when you look at our natural capital in new forms and in different scales. So we are a big landowner in the city, but we also work very closely with our partners. The other thing in terms of our nature recovery network, which you can see on the screen, is that we've moved from thinking about our green and blue spaces as liabilities and thinking of them as key infrastructure assets for the city. So whether that is around the wellbeing agenda, activity agenda, or thinking about our climate adaptation, these are key infrastructure assets now. And we have to think about how we can utilise those assets in different ways to deliver across multiple local agendas. So again, this isn't a pigeonholed environmental project. For the sake of it, it's actually about meeting lots of other local agendas, from the economic growth around a big push on green jobs through to a lot of work we're doing with our children and young people. And across all these sites, what's key to that is advanced habitat creation and recovery, because high quality natural environment will help us deliver these key multi-agency and multi-agenda initiatives. So where did this come from? This hasn't happened overnight, just to be really clear. We started this back in 2020 through the Future Parks Accelerator programme, which really allowed us to have a good look at our sites, what we wanted to achieve with them, but also importantly, how we had a real change in our approach so that we can do more without putting any more pressure on local authority budgets, because that was really key. That then progressed into working on other programmes of work. But what was really key about the Future Parks Accelerator is the support we had to look at our own sites, to look at what we can do with them. And linked to that, we had two other streams of work. One was about workforce development and really creating a fit for purpose 21st century workforce, and collaborations and relationships. And I mentioned both of those because they're really key in actually how we do this sustainable finance. And so once we'd got worked up on some of these ideas, when the Natural Environment Investment Readiness Framework came along, we were able to then take it along a next step. But I would emphasise that when we started this journey, we had no clue what we were doing in terms of the finance side, and it has been a really big and very exciting learning curve over the last couple of years. So we didn't start just with the Habitat Bank. What we started with is what would a place-based whole city approach to sustainable transport look like, and this is what we're now calling Ocean City Nature. And we've got a very strong vision around this, about creating a resilient, accessible natural environment that spreads across the city, and looking at, importantly, replicable and scalable funding ecosystems. So we are looking at sustainable enterprises and just how we develop a funding strategy that goes beyond what we've done traditionally around grant funding, but actually gives something that enables the city to utilise those assets, invest in them, and then that investment returns hugely in terms of the benefits it gives the city. And as you can see, we've got three areas of focus. One around creating a nature-rich city, because we know that really high quality nature will help us achieve our ambitions. Supporting thriving, empowering communities. They must be the stewards. We know that it's really important that they have to be part of the decision making. These are their spaces. But the outputs of doing that really well are multiple around either physical or mental health, around sustainable transport, skills development and employment. And we've seen this come through many areas. And also recognising the value from ecosystem service delivery. So how we actually manage those spaces to look at a sustainable financial return, which allows us to invest more. So that led us to our Habitat Bank. So this is the first of what we call our sub-funds under Ocean City Nature, and it's the one we've pushed further on. And there'll be a lot of detail following, but just to give you a summary of why we're doing this. So one of the things that we wanted to ensure happens is that we didn't have any risk from the new duties of nature leaving the city and that revenue leaving the city. To have not invested in the Habitat Bank would have actually put us in a worse position, because we were losing the Section 106 contributions that would usually fund some of this work. We also wanted that income to be reinvested in green spaces and for public good, not private, and that land may be running at a loss currently can now actually generate income. It can be really realising the assets. We always knew they were, but now we can do it monetarily. And local authorities are in a really good place to take on this role and to benefit from it. In providing credible local offer, we can also work with our developers much better. So a really frictionless engagement with the BNG and ensuring that developers can see that their money is being spent locally too, which is really important in terms of their sales. We can benefit communities, and it enables us to plan and deliver these sites strategically. So we can retain what we usually have in planning in terms of management of where these sites are, and we really will be doing more and meeting our ambitions. Thank you. So I'm now going to hand over to Chris.
Thank you, Kat. And yeah, hello everybody. My name's Chris Avent. I'm the Green Estate Manager in the Environmental Planning Division at Plymouth City Council. And yeah, just going to, leading on from Kat's kind of overview of the sort of strategic position and where we got to, we're going to do a really deep dive now into some of the aspects of work which has enabled us to reach a point of realising a live habitat bank in Plymouth. You're going to meet some members of the amazing team that have contributed to this over the last 2 or 3 years. They're going to give you some of their insights into kind of how what we've learned along the way and how we've been enabled ourselves to work to do this, to achieve this. And that's both from PCC, but also from partner organisations that we've been working with. And I'll let them introduce themselves as they come on screen. So just to start out, as Kat's mentioned, kind of the Habitat Bank kind of leads straight from the creation of biodiversity net gain. Okay, so mandatory biodiversity net gain is enacted through the Environment Act as an update to the Town and Country Planning Act and came into force in February 2024 this year. So obviously our work has predated kind of that legislative requirement for mandatory net gain. We've been in a really fortunate position in Plymouth whereby we had biodiversity net gain as policy in Plymouth since 2019. So it was something we were familiar with working with. So it really did kind of give us a good sort of step forward in terms of how we work with our planning colleagues and also in terms of delivery on the ground, what it took to achieve biodiversity net gain. But what is it? So just in its simplest sense here, we've got the diagram on the screen, which just kind of introduces that concept if it's not familiar to you. So it works, importantly, the most important thing is that we introduce the DEFRA metric into the picture. So DEFRA metric, biodiversity net gain metric, is a standard approach, standard way of measuring biodiversity. And it's really important to recognise that it introduces the biodiversity unit as a unit, a measure of biodiversity, which is standardised across the country. But they couldn't have done any of this work without that in place. So a developer, for example, would carry out a biodiversity net gain assessment using the metric on their development site pre-development and against their plans post-development, and they have to show that they achieve a minimum of a 10% net gain in those that biodiversity value, either on their site solely, or if needed, they need to look, if they're below that 10% threshold, they'll need to look for off-site provision of biodiversity units to enable them to meet that requirement and effectively receive a planning approval for their scheme. So that's kind of a really, it kind of drives kind of effectively the market for biodiversity net gain. So just to show that, for sort of avoidance of doubt, the biodiversity net gain legislation doesn't sort of trump kind of existing kind of hierarchies and expectations around mitigation hierarchy, which any planning process would expect to see. So avoidance still sort of sits there at the top of that hierarchy, and that would need to be evidenced. And then also, on-site delivery is still a key part of this equation. So we certainly in Plymouth, our planning colleagues will be looking for good quality on-site biodiversity net gain delivery. Failing that, if that 10% threshold still doesn't reach, we've got the option, or developers have the option of seeking out biodiversity units from off-site providers. And that's where our habitat banking model comes into play, is servicing that off-site market. As a point of last resort, if there isn't a local offer of biodiversity units available, then there is a DEFRA statutory credits available, introduced their price, but they're priced purposefully at a very high level to kind of ensure that they are only a point of last resort. Figures, kind of expected from DEFRA, which modelling they've done do show that kind of this expected to be a kind of quite significant market playing out in terms of biodiversity units, requirement for the development market, and we'll come into some detail we did locally about assessing that supply and demand in future slides. So importantly, then, just to kind of finish this section off, this is the creation of the biodiversity unit gain market effectively brings into play buyers and sellers. So sellers of biodiversity units are landowners or land managers. Local authorities fall into that bracket as landowners. And in contrast, that the buyers are the developers in the first instance, the developers who are acquiring biodiversity units to meet their planning obligations. And we get this flow of payments and supply of biodiversity units within that market. There are future markets potentially coming down the road. We won't touch on those too much here, but it's certainly sort of part of the picture we're looking at in Plymouth in terms of future markets for sale of biodiversity units and potential growth of habitat banking and other green finance strands. I think importantly to say, and we'll come on to a bit more detail around this in future slides as well, there are some quite clear requirements which DEFRA set out in terms of legal agreements that need to be in place. And the registration of these biodiversity units on a national register for off-site delivery, and also the requirements for local planning authority in setting up a Section 106 or conservation covenant to give a legal document which an obligation around delivering biodiversity units. So I'm going to hand over to Bethan now, who's just going to give you a bit more of an overview of the concept of habitat banking and how that works with biodiversity net gain.
Thanks, Chris. Hi everyone, I'm Bethan Scragg from the National Trust, and we've been working alongside Plymouth and others on our NERF funded habitat banking exploration. So I'm here to tell you that habitat banking can seem really complex and can seem very overwhelming. So don't panic. The biggest challenge is one, trying to understand it yourselves, and two, trying to explain it to others. So hopefully we're helping you with that today. So in its simplest form, we're creating or restoring a habitat and setting it aside and banking it and banking those resulting biodiversity units. Developers can then buy those biodiversity units to meet the mandatory 10% net gain requirements. But where do we find the money to create that habitat or the units in advance of the development happening? So this is the really clever bit, and this is the bit that's new to us all. We can attract upfront investment and use it to fund our delivery. So the investor is then repaid as biodiversity units are generated and sold. That sale of biodiversity units provides a critical revenue stream for us to maintain the newly restored or created habitat for that minimum of 30 years. So our biodiversity unit revenue both repays our investors for the upfront cost of creating the habitat, but also provides a revenue stream for us to maintain them for the next 30 years. So if you have some brilliant financial minds on board to help you with your sales strategy, they can help you to map out which units to sell and when, and you just might be able to generate a surplus. And that's really where the magic of what we're talking about today, that's where it all lies. So just imagine that for a moment, extra money to put back into your green space, provision, to buy new kit, maybe gain a new operative or two, or even squeeze out a few more years of site maintenance past that 30-year period. So back to our tricky challenge of trying to explain and articulate what habitat banking is to others who you work with. Some people are much better with a visual representation, and Kat and Chris have used this really good illustration to explain the concept and process to councillors and senior management and all their key stakeholders. So here we have in the blue our wonderful investors putting funds into our habitat banking vehicle, providing us with the means to create those lovely habitat units. Then we have our developers circling, waiting to buy our units to satisfy their BNG obligations. And all of those payments are going to allow us to repay our investors and give us our revenue stream and generate that little bit of magical surplus we talked about, fingers crossed. So at this point in the webinar, we just wanted to reassure you, and we've mentioned it a few times yesterday as well as earlier, that we'll be providing you with a guide to setting up an urban habitat banking vehicle. It's an evolving document, but it will help you to try and identify the steps and tasks that you need to carry out back in your own places should you choose to take this journey on. We've been working with Plymouth for several years now, and whilst they're our absolute favourites, we have also been working with a group of fast followers to explore what habitat banking options might be available to them. So we've added to Plymouth's experience as trailblazers with even more learning from Birmingham, from Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole, and from Newcastle. And we've put all the information into the guide to share with you. And you can see from this slide some of the steps that we take you through. But Chris is actually going to walk us through some of those now and take us into a deeper dive of what Plymouth have done. Back to you, Chris.
Thank you, Bethan. So yeah, we're not going to be able to go through the whole 12 steps there, but we picked out some of the ones that we think are really key and introduce some people who've worked on those to give you kind of a really good insight into the steps that need to be taken. And just to stress that, you know, as I've said earlier, you know, we've done this kind of from a standing start, so we've been finding our way through this. So although this has taken us a significant period of time, hopefully the learning we've had and sharing this with others will enable you to kind of move at a faster pace and probably disappear down a few less rabbit holes than we disappeared down on our journey. I'm just going to start with kind of probably for me is kind of in my role and the work that I've kind of done, worked in this kind of at the head of this. Kind of the internal stakeholders have been absolutely critical, and you can see them represented on the screen here. A huge number of internal stakeholders we've had to work with over the last 2.5 years to enable us to get to the point we're at now. I think I'm not going to go through them all in detail there. The slide kind of illustrates kind of the different departments or different teams within departments. I've learned an awful lot around different functions, even within kind of our legal teams and our finance departments, and different roles that we need to kind of make sure we engage with and understand. But broadly, so it's led by environmental planning. So environmental planning is the division that Kat, myself, and various members of the team you're going to meet work in, and we've led this work. If you move then from 11 o'clock, we've done this in a roundabout way, I don't know why, but anyway, 11 o'clock back round to about 5 o'clock there, we've got kind of a various number of internal teams through planning, legal, our environmental ops teams, finance, land and property, housing delivery. We've all been really key to kind of informing the work of building up our business cases and our kind of proposal, then to our senior management and our elected members, which runs them around from sort of 4 o'clock up through to about 2 o'clock there. Our corporate management team, working with our democratic support team, to engage with our cabinet members, with scrutiny committees to ensure that, you know, everything we're proposing, presenting is really well versed and it really doesn't compromise other areas of council ambition or targets. And then finally, we've got kind of now where we are now, a whole range of including kind of our finance team kind of operationalizing this and bringing the Habitat Bank into life, which is the stage where we are at now. So engaging with these stakeholders and being able to explain the concept of habitat banking and presenting kind of business cases to them and taking forward kind of that work has been really key to moving forward. And I think some of the things you're going to see in these next steps kind of hopefully will give you some insight into the ways in which you need to present that to enable those conversations to happen. So just gives an overview. So I'm just going to go into a section looking at kind of how we built the business cases around this. So how do we build the business case about Habitat Bank? Very much it starts with a supply and demand assessment. That was kind of the first step broadly we took. So looking at from one side, supply of biodiversity units from our green space sites across the city. and then mapping that against demand. So demand coming from planning requirements over the next 5 years. So that's where talking to colleagues, for example, in housing delivery and planning were really important to inform that part of the process. Also kind of understanding the habitat management planning that was required to deliver the biodiversity net gain, and importantly, putting some really detailed costings to delivering that habitat management plan for each of the sites was really important, because that allowed us to build up a really strong financial model and in turn write a really robust and strong business case. All of that information, having that all available in that way, made it a lot easier for us to work then with described senior management teams, scrutiny committees, elected members across the board, to be able to familiarise this concept and the business case with them, and ensure that when we were being asked difficult questions, we were in a good position to be able to answer them. We were confident that we could address the majority of those, and I will stress the majority. Absolutely, along the way, we learned things as we went, and we did have to circle back at different points to make sure that people kind of came along the journey with us. And then finally, at the point of the final decision, I'll come on to a bit more detail around that, but we're at a point where we have got £500,000 worth of investment raised, invested by Plymouth City Council into the Habitat Bank in our first 3 pilot sites. So really big achievement. Still not absolutely there yet. We're kind of still working on some of the absolute detail of that, but very much at the end of that journey. So I'm going to hand over to Theo now, who's going to take you through some of the detail on supply and demand assessment.
Thanks, Chris. Hi everyone, my name is Theo Nichols. I'm a Natural Infrastructure Officer working in the Green Estates team at Plymouth City Council. We're just going to start off with looking at how we came up with the supply sites that you see on the screen here. What you see is the black outline is the Plymouth policy area, and the red outline is the Plymouth City boundary, and then in green here you have the supply sites. And we found those supply sites through a desk-based exercise, kind of identifying what would be suitable for delivering biodiversity net gain. And that was by calculating what the biodiversity unit baseline was by commissioning ecological consultants to perform UK HAB surveys and biodiversity condition assessments on those sites. Initially, the supply site assessment was 29 sites in the beginning, and then we did another 33 down the line ongoing, so we could build up our kind of biodiversity net gain audit of the city. And with the ecological reports and the site level knowledge, we determined what viable biodiversity unit delivery could be made on those sites through good habitat management to enhance the sites, creation, restoration, and also maintenance of those sites. And this then allowed us to kind of factor in what the delivery costs for these would be, which kind of gear you towards kind of the modeling of the numbers of what the worth is of those supply sites. Can I have the next slide, please? And simultaneous to doing the supply assessment, we also looked at the demand assessments. And again, well, this was a purely desk-based exercise looking at demand. And this is looking at sites within the LPA area that were allocated for development. And we used an exclusionary methodology to determine what sites would be viable in demand that could be used if they were developed on. So we could then calculate, using estimations and the DEFRA impact assessment from 2019, how much would be lost from those development sites, and then how much could be then offset and used in the habitat banking vehicle. And that kind of runs through these different factors, generating those, running different scenarios to kind of model what would happen, because it's obviously very difficult to estimate from where it's been developed, how much will be lost, how much will be delivered on site, and then what will be done off site. And it's kind of taking those different variables and running through different models. And you've got a bit of an example, a very blurry example, I should add. We kind of lost the resolution there. But this is, using satellite imagery, kind of broad habitat categorization to kind of gauge what there is on site, and then running that through, making some quite broad brush estimations. And obviously none of these are ground truthed, because it'd be quite resource intensive to ground truth sites, which will already be ground truthed when they are developed on. So that'd be quite like double handling and waste of resources there. And so it requires those assumptions. Can I have the next slide there, please? And so, yeah, so you kept doing those assessments simultaneously, and then this is kind of the summary figures of what we have there. So as I was saying earlier, 29 of those supply sites were initially assessed. That was through the UK HAB surveys and the biodiversity condition assessments, and then using that data to calculate what could feasibly and realistically be delivered from a biodiversity unit's point of view. And that was across 378 hectares of land, you know, with the capacity of 780 biodiversity units to be delivered. And then we can then put in these cost estimations of what the values there, connecting the dots. And as I said earlier, yeah, an additional 33 supply sites have been surveyed, adding to that Plymouth City Council estate, knowing what we have, which informs the habitat banking vehicle. And then 30 demand sites were looked at. And yeah, this gives you the basis of what your supply and demand assessment is, which is essential for then how your habitat banking vehicle will operate. And again, generating these figures, which can be used for business case, which is essential. Because if you don't have any of this, you can't do any of this. You can't calculate, you can't persuade, you have no evidence base. So you need to put in this initial investment to find out what you have on your sites, perform this desk-based exercises, commission consultants, and then you can show what you have and make it a reality and see if it's a worthwhile investment, because some cities may not have enough green space where this to be viable. And so it requires, you know, quite an intensive exercise and resources to do that. But, you know, the payoffs being we have local investments, we can enhance our core sites, we can deliver our local nature recovery strategy, allowing all of these things. So really brief, you know, kind of almost overview of how we did it, what it looks like. This is something you could do a whole webinar on, as opposed to a couple minutes, which I've gone over, Chris. It's terrible of me. But yeah, very brief, and you can go that further later. And I think it's back over to you now, Chris.
Thank you, Theo. That's great. And I think just to kind of accentuate that point, I think the value of the supply and demand assessment, I think, was when we were familiarising the concept of habitat banking, particularly with our finance team, because that's long term. That's a long-term pipeline that we're looking at there. You know, we've only just taken 3 pilot sites for our first tranche of investment in our work, but this shows that actually over time that both the supply and the demand are in play, and actually the numbers associated with that are very meaningful in the context of local authority finances. So, you know, going back to that point of realizing kind of revenues off our existing assets. So yeah, kind of can't sort of state the importance of that enough, but as I said, a lot more detail there, which we won't go to now. So the principles that we set out really early on in our process were really, really important. They're a really important guiding document for us. And we engaged a range of stakeholders when we put these together. So I think it's probably like going back to 2021, even when we kind of started looking at this. We wanted to make sure that, you know, this wasn't going to be a race to the bottom, and we were setting a really high bar around delivering effectively, you know, habitat banking business. So, you know, making money out of kind of our nature sites. We needed to ensure that what we were doing had absolute integrity, had credibility to deliver across, a triple bottom line impact. So it had environmental value, environmental impact, social impact, as well as economic impact. And so setting these out, kind of really gave us directed our course, and we used it throughout over the last 2-3 years. We have used this and we've circled back to these principles to ensure that each stage that we've got to, that what we're doing and what we're proposing is in line to delivering against all 3 of those elements. So I'd recommend highly that, yes, having something like this, I think this is available for people to kind of, work with as well. You have something in place which gives you that kind of guiding light. So let's take a little bit of a break from the numbers. We get back onto the numbers now, just to give kind of a bit more insight. So I'm going to hand it to Sanchi, who is going to talk you through some of the financial modelling and our pilot sites.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone. My name is Sanchi, and I'm a senior associate at Finance Earth. We are a social enterprise and an FCA-regulated fund manager and investment advisor. We've been working with PCC and the National Trust on this BNG project for a few years now, as well as looking at other ecosystem service markets. So based on the introduction that Theo just gave you to the assessment of supply and demand in Plymouth, We obviously had a long list of potential BNG sites that we now had to pick from. And as Chris said, we ended up picking 3. And the way that we did that was using this pilot site criteria that you can see on screen. So there were 3 key criteria that we used: eligibility, strategic fit, and viability. And these were based on the offsetting principles, and they were also based on learnings from the projects. So as you can see here, within eligibility, we tried to pick sites that were controlled or managed by Plymouth. We also tried to pick sites that were not funded through any other sources or any other grants to make sure that BNG income would be additional on these sites. In terms of strategic fit, we tried to find sites that were located within the nature recovery network, that they were close to ongoing or upcoming developments, sites that were connected with other strategic habitats, sites that had public access and that were close to more deprived neighborhoods, and were kind of geographically spread out across the city. Finally, we looked at viability, which was just around, the scale or the size of the site. So typically at least over 15 hectares as a minimum. Looked at the habitat mix available on the sites, because that has an impact on viability. For example, grassland sites do produce units faster than woodland sites, just as an example. We looked at the costs for delivering the target habitats on these sites, both the upfront habitat restoration or creation costs, and then the ongoing management costs over the 30-year obligation period. And then we tried to see if there was demand available through that demand assessment, which was near these sites. So as you can see on the map here, the 3 sites that we ended up picking, they are quite geographically spread out across the city. Canwoods and Hamwoods both have public access. They are close to historically deprived neighborhoods. Canwoods, Hamwoods, and Chelsea Meadow are all part of the local nature recovery network. And thus these two seem to provide a good mix of sites as our initial tranche for the vehicle. Here you can see a bit more about the habitat mix of the sites and their size and scale. So as you can see, all of them are above that 15 hectare mark, which means looking at the sites, even just individually, they were potentially financially viable sites if they were delivered on their own. As you can see, they're all PCC managed. The habitat mix is a good mix of grassland, scrub, and woodland. And this was important because, as I said, the grassland and scrub units tend to mature faster than the woodland units. And a combination of these habitats tends to give you a stable income stream across the life of the project. Also, it gives you a mix of different habitat units that are available for sale. So I think we've seen that BNG units of higher distinctiveness can be priced higher as compared to BNG units of lower distinctiveness. So when you have a habitat mix available, it just means that you can have varied pricing ranges as well. Once we identified the sites and so on, we also looked at the interventions needed to actually deliver the target habitats. And those interventions are listed out on the slide below, and these were costed up over that 30-year period. Once we costed up those interventions, both upfront and over the 30-year period, the next step was essentially putting those costs into a financial model. And here we would recommend working with a financial advisor. So Finance Earth has developed a bespoke BNG model to allow you to do this. And what we did was we created a model for each of the sites individually. As you can see in the pilot cost approach row in the middle, the average maintenance costs of approximately £48,000 per hectare were the majority of the costs for the delivery of these sites. So essentially that long-term forecast over the 30 years of what it might cost to manage these sites is a key factor that drives, whether or not these sites would be viable. Then looking at the revenue approach, this is also something that we did for each pilot site separately. So here we looked at different sales strategies that could be taken to sell the BNG units that would be generated from these sites. Habitat banking just refers to selling the units after they've been verified or they reach their target condition. And then the other approach is selling them upfront or before verification as land banking units. So it's a good idea to try and mix both, again, to have that stable income stream over life. We also included a 10% redundancy rate, which is essentially a fancy word for a risk buffer. So this meant that there's a risk buffer in the model, assuming that 10% of the units are never sold or are never generated due to ecological risks or market demand risks and so on. So as you can see, the average income across the pilot sites was approximately £63,000 per hectare. And this allowed us to be able to cover 35 years of project maintenance, so 5 years more than the obligation period. This was also because we used something called an endowment, which is, you can use mechanisms such as an interest-bearing account where any additional revenue that you have that is not being used to meet costs can then be invested in a savings account where you earn some interest, and then that can help push the life of your project further. Finally, once we had these individual pilot sites, we used those to develop an aggregated model which sat on top of all the sites. And the reason for doing this was that this allowed us to push in all the costs related to the management of the vehicle, project management time for PCC, individuals, looking at all the back office functions such as accounting that were needed, upfront costs related to marketing, related to legal costs, and so on. And all of these were fitted into that aggregated model. It also allowed us to understand what the total financing requirement is. So what are the upfront financing needs to deliver these 3 sites at an aggregated level or together. I'll also just caveat here that, of course, this is based on assumptions that are continued to be refined and updated as we learn more about the BNG market, and they are subject to change. Back to you, Chris.
Thank you, Sanchi. Yeah, I mean, it's a really key part, obviously, the work we did to build our business case was that financial modelling. And I think importantly underpinned, I think, trying to pick up on one particular aspect of that. And I think for those people in the webinar who are kind of like green space managers or land managers in this bit here, kind of building up that really detailed information around what the cost will be to enable you to deliver your habitat management plan over that 30-year period is really, really key, because that drives all the other figures in that the bigger financial model which Sanchi's described in the previous slide. So taking time to do that is really important. And split that down broadly into two tasks. This is how we approached it. I mean, everyone can approach this differently. So our first task was to create kind of a cost card of standard costs that we can use. We had something which we worked with, but we had to kind of refine that and bring that up to date in line with sort of biodiversity net gain requirements. And that involved us delving into kind of our kind of internal accounting kind of figures to understand, to make sure we were capturing all those costs accurately. And then again, involved lots of engagement with our operations teams to kind of really kind of tease out kind of the detail around that, and with our fleet department and others, just to kind of really make sure we build those costs up accurately. Also working with finance, with our accounting team, to make sure that kind of, future inflation rates, pay awards kind of are all similarly built into those standard costs. And then task 2, using that cost card then to build that cost model template, which Sanchi referred to, over that 30-year period. So that's where having that kind of insight, that knowledge around kind of ecological expertise married up with kind of then accounting and financing is really, really important to make sure that it stacks up from both perspectives. And that data then, that information flows through into that bigger financial model. So really important part of the work. So this one just goes now into just a little bit around the sort of the governance of this and the decision making. So it's taken us 3 executive decisions to get through kind of the point we're at now. I just want to give a quick insight into what that involved. So because it may be that you kind of, I think it plays a little bit to insight which is useful around kind of how people come along the journey with you and what they need to understand as they go through this, particularly obviously sort of key decision makers. So our first decision was in November 2021, and that really kind of set out the picture and the challenges and the opportunities which were being presented through the implementation of the Environment Act, and kind of the options available to the council in that space. And we had the option of, as ever, kind of doing nothing. We had the option with kind of using third-party habitat bank providers. We looked at the option of kind of doing it in-house, and we looked at the option of looking at setting up an arm's length vehicle, a company outside of the council, arm's length of the council, to act as our habitat bank. And on the balance, the recommendation was to go with the arm's length vehicle option, which was approved, and that carried us through. It gave us the mandate then to get into a bit of the detail around what does that company structure need to look like? What are the governance arrangements around that to ensure that that works really, really well? Legal support at this stage is absolutely critical. So both internally with your own legal teams, but also we've used external legal advice as well to help support this work, to kind of build up a really good picture of that. And again, look at the options around that. You go into a lot of detail around articles of association and kind of the nature and the type of companies or group of companies which you may want to establish. So March 22, we were able to present a case which was approved around setting up a small group of companies to enable us to act as our habitat bank. And I'll come on to a bit more detail on that in a few minutes. And the third decision we then took to our cabinet members was a business case for investment. So we'd done the financial modelling. We knew that we needed £500,000 to invest in these 3 pilot sites, to do the work, to improve the habitats, to generate the biodiversity units, which we then had available for sale to the developer market and generate the revenues flowing back through it. So we took that business case, and that was approved in June 23. So that gave us that stimulus and that input to then go into the stage right now, which is actually operationalizing and bringing that habitat bank to life. Within that, we also attended a scrutiny session as well with our governance committee. This is quite an innovative approach, and kind of there was an element of nervousness internally people wanted assurance that what we were doing kind of was the right thing to be doing. We had all the right arrangements in place to enable that to happen. So quite a journey. So definitely something to build from and think about, kind of factoring into your own journey if you're going to take this route. I think I'm going to hand over to Wendy. You sat beside me, so I'm going to pass it around to Wendy, who's going to talk to you about financial governance.
Hello, I'm Wendy Eldridge. I'm a lead accountancy manager at Plymouth City Council. I'm going to talk about financial governance between Plymouth City Council and the Habitat banking vehicle, which may not be such as well-trodden path as the one in the picture shows. However, from a treasury management perspective, it could be represented as taking a piggy bank, in this case biodiversity units, through the pathway required to support the environmental journey the habitat vehicle will be committing itself in going forward. Key points to note that with the approach we've taken is setting up of separate banking accounts so that financial transactions between Plymouth City Council and the habitat vehicle can be sort of separately accounted, and put controls with that. Using the support of the Plymouth City Council's Treasury Management Fund function, implement consistent treasury management practices, principles and schedules, including segregation of duties, input and authorization of transactions. So very, very bland in the full landscape of habitat banking, but it's that fundamental sort of control of the monies going through the habitat vehicle. This would ensure compliance with the CITFA Chartered Institute of Public Finance Accountancy Code of Practice for Treasury Management, and would be supporting the strong cash management that's needed to support 30 plus years of service to delivery of the habitat banking vehicle. Also, moving forward, as a previous slide referred to interest, we would be looking at onward investment practices with further environmental, social and governance investment considerations that would align to the sort of beliefs of the habitat vehicle.
So where are we? So company structure. So just a quick illustration. Wendy's kind of touched on it there. Obviously, you know, how do we set this up? So what have we done? So we've established 2 companies, and the reason we've established 2 companies is because we're looking to the future. I mean, partly there's two main purposes. One is quite strategic. So we've established one company at arm's length of Plymouth City Council called Ocean City Nature. It's a company limited by guarantee. Plymouth City Council is the sole member of that vehicle. So there's a degree of control between the council and that vehicle. And the board of directors currently is a number of PCC officers and directors, but will broaden to have more representation than that, as recognised in the decision which was taken back in March 22. The reason we've got a vehicle at strategic level is because beneath that, as well as habitat banking and taking advantage of biodiversity, and again, we're also looking to the future of new other green finance revenue streams. We may want to create separate investment funds around. So that could be around carbon credits. It could be both in a kind of woodland setting, woodland carbon credits, maybe looking at kind of blue carbon in the marine environment. There's a whole range of different funds we could set up in the same way that we've set up a habitat bank. So then beneath the Ocean City Nature, we've set up a company limited by shares called Ocean City Biodiversity. The sole shareholder is Ocean City Nature, and that's effectively just an operational vehicle. It just holds the investment which we've raised at £500,000, and it uses that money to deliver against the obligations which it has to deliver the habitat management plans and objectives on the 3 sites. And the money flows around from Ocean City Biodiversity, and we contract back to Plymouth City Council the work and activity to run that habitat bank. So 2 slightly different functions there, both strategic and operational. And as I said, looking to the future, so important to understand kind of why we've done it in that way. But it isn't the only way. We looked at a range of different options of setting up. Next slide, please. So this just then kind of gives a bit more insight into how that works and how that functions. So there's a few elements here which is probably important to understand. So the habitat bank sat at the middle of that diagram there it acts as our habitat banking vehicle. Plymouth City Council, and you will be familiar with this as if you're from local authorities, you know, we have a range of different functions and statutory duties which we perform. So one of the other reasons for setting up a habitat bank was that we give a level of distance from the local planning authority function and enabled us to comply with kind of the requirements which come from the biodiversity net gain regulations to enable us to provide off-site units on Plymouth City Council owned land. For that, we need to enter into a legal agreement with the local planning authority or a responsible body, which are kind of in the process of being implemented by government. But at this stage, we're working with the local planning authority to enact Section 106 agreement, so act as legal obligations to deliver, monitor, report against our habitat management plans. The other on the left-hand side of the slide there, Plymouth City Council kind of sitting as the landowner. So that's kind of acting to deliver the operations of the habitat bank. That's agreed through a management service agreement, and that allows the revenues to flow from the habitat bank back to Plymouth City Council, effectively to pay for that service and to bring the revenues in to manage those sites over a 30-year plus period. That then feeds back through, and it's importantly also remember, for off-site provision of habitat bank and biodiversity units, there's a requirement to register with the Natural England Biodiversity Net Gain Register. So the habitat bank and through Plymouth City Council will perform that function of making sure that we're complying with all the necessary requirements, both through setting up of supply unit sites, but also registering sale of units with that register. So to enable us to do that, to register with the Biodiversity Net Gain Register, there are some key documents which need to be in place, as well as also some key documents to enable us to kind of enact the habitat bank, to operationalise it. I'm going to go into a little bit of detail on a couple of those on the next couple of slides. I just wanted to give you a bit of an overview of the work that we've done, and again, this is where we've having legal involvement has been really key to build up the documentation required around this. So the first one, the lease of land. The land, these 3 sites, is leased to the Habitat Bank. That's kind of a requirement to be able to register with the biodiversity net gain register, and it gives kind of that accountability for the Habitat Bank. So that we've set a 50-year term for those leases, to make sure that we've got enough headroom and enough space at the end of the 30-year obligation period to cover that whole length of time. We also need to have a Section 106 agreement in place, as described, between the local planning authority, Habitat Bank, and the landowner, as necessary, and depending on your own situation. You need to have a habitat management and monitoring plan in place for each site as well. And Thea will talk a little bit about that in a couple of minutes. We've also then got kind of effectively contractual documents which we need to put together. So that management service agreement, so to ensure that we've got a kind of clear agreement, a contract between the Habitat Bank and the local authority. An investor contract, so kind of where we're setting up investments, then you need a contract to kind of make sure that is kind of all accountable and as needed. And then a sales contract template as well. So every sale that you make to a developer will require a sales contract. So you'll need to have a template in place to enable you to make those sales. There are some heads of terms, I think, for the and the packs that we released following this. There are some heads of terms templates kind of being released around that. So hopefully give a bit of help, helping hand or a leg up to people kind of looking at this. My colleague Laura from Land and Property was going to talk a little bit about her key learning in the same way that Wendy has. Unfortunately, Laura couldn't be here this afternoon, so I'm just going to cover this slide on her behalf. Just wanted to kind of pick out 4 key points of learning from a land and property point of view. So Laura is a surveyor, a principal surveyor in our land and property team, and we've worked closely with her to enable kind of the lease to kind of be enacted on each of the 3 sites. So few things which I think I wouldn't have known necessarily that we had to think about before we kind of entered into this. Because we were effectively disposing of the site, as in the council was disposing of the site, we needed to do 2 things. We needed to ensure that the consideration of the rental value kind of was compliant with the Local Government Act. So we needed to ensure that and have a kind of statement why and how kind of that rental value worked. We also needed to publish a loss of public open space advert, because although in effect the site won't change, access will not be restricted to the public, nothing changes, is registered as a public open space, and therefore there is a requirement, again under the Local Government Act, for us to publicise if the council is disposing of that land, either through sale or lease to another entity. So we had to go through that process, which took a month over the just post-Christmas period. We also need to build up the terms of the lease and those heads of terms. And I think there was a really interesting discussions there around kind of that interplay between public open space versus the BNG objectives on the site, which we had to work our way through and make sure that the way we were framing and kind of setting up the terms of those lease, so setting up the terms of the lease or the leases was accurate, and it wasn't kind of going to cause any issues down the road from both perspectives. And then timing, I think Laura wants to accentuate the kind of importance of timing and involving your land and property team at kind of probably the earliest stage possible, just to make sure you tease out some of these issues and kind of you can have these. I think this is one where possibly we're a bit late coming to our surveyor team and probably had to sort of redo a bit of work, which, you know, if we'd done it, spoke to them a little bit earlier, we wouldn't have had to do that. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Theo again, just to give us a quick insight into the habitat management plans.
Thanks, Chris. So the habitat management and monitoring plan template, which is provided by Natural England, is optional to use when for biodiversity net gain. But, you know, kind of following due diligence and using what they've got, it is a very thorough document, and it encompasses kind of everything there is that is required. And there is some good things about this, and there is some not so good things about this. It's kind of going into that. And I've just kind of put on a snapshot here, again, quite blurry, apologies. And this is showing the site Hamwoods Local Nature Reserve, and kind of in the blurred green, you can kind of see enhancements, and then that crosshatch yellow maintained, and then that crosshatch orange retained enhanced, and then in the light blue retained. And it's just like an example of one of the things that goes into the habitat management and monitoring templates. And just to say there, yeah, so it's a very detailed document, so it requires quite a lot of it's great because it requires everything you need when looking at what the metric is saying to what you need to do to achieve your required targets. And it acts as that kind of one-stop shop. So it has all the parcel level data. It shows each of the condition criteria you need to improve to attain what it is you're doing to deliver biodiversity units. And it's at that, yeah, and it being at parcel level detail, you can see each of the parcels, the sites that you're doing it to. So it's very precise in that format. This is all very good, but it does bring with it some negatives. It makes it quite a cumbersome document. So because you have to input all of this, it almost feels like you're taking the metric, which can be not very user friendly, and which is nice to have in a Word document, but it's almost that extension of the metric because of the amount of data you have to input to show you're meeting your target requirements. And that can make it quite unwieldy. And therefore it wouldn't really be very suitable like a traditional habitat management plan, which you would give to a delivery team to make a reality on the site. You'd need to do quite a lot of heavy editing to make that fit for purpose. And just thinking on how ways that can be improved. So it kind of it's a Word format of the metric, included all the maps, and it's a bit more succinct, and it's got a lot more environmental data, so like soil data included in it. It would be really nice to see Natural England, in the future, where they have where you can export GIS data and import it to the metric. Quite nice to see that kind of future where you can take the metric data and export it to the habitat management monitoring template. So it has it all in there, but it can be, which is fantastic, like planning obligation, habitat banking vehicle point of view. So your investors and everyone can see exactly what you're doing. It's very open and it's all there for everyone to see, which has its very strong benefits, but could be more wieldy in the future.
So just a very quick one on marketing comms. So just kind of the back end, well, not the back end, but kind of a point of kind of operationalizing the Habitat Bank. Obviously, kind of creating a name and kind of doing all that stuff, creating a website, kind of really important in terms of kind of setting out how we're going to engage with the market, with our buyers or units. So just wanted to kind of give a little bit of an insight into kind of our work around comms planning and marketing comms planning here. So 4 kind of key steps which we followed. The first one, we had some great support from National Trust in doing this, defining our audiences, what they need to hear. It's not just, the public are obviously a key audience we're going to be talking to, but also quite a specialist market as well. It's very early days in biodiversity net gain and habitat bank in terms of the public eye. So very mindful of that we don't kind of scare the horses in the kind of in the public domain. We need to make sure our language is kind of appropriate and it fits with the people we're talking to. We're also potentially going to be talking to investors as well in the future. So we want to make sure that we've got kind of a really credible front face and using credible language. So messaging, the next bit, kind of making sure that once, different audiences that we're talking to, we've got the right tools and the right language to make sure that we're, setting ourselves in the right place in the market. Absolutely, kind of this is about integrity, so making sure that what we're doing kind of is delivering benefits both for nature and for people in our urban green spaces. So had to be a bit of thinking around what some of those key messages were, and actually they may be distinct for particular audiences. They may be messages which run across all of our audiences. Thinking about branding and voice, so kind of what do you want to look like, how does that work? In terms of the governance model you have, that may be kind of separate from your local authority, it may be close to your local authority. So depending on which route you choose to go down, you just need to make sure and play that it's in context. For us, we to consider it kind of amongst the kind of whole range of initiatives and projects, a whole wider program of activity which we have running kind of around our natural spaces in the city. So kind of it's quite complicated to kind of think, well, where does this fit into the picture, and how do we kind of market this in the right way as to being our habitat banking vehicle, our green finance vehicle. And then finally, channels that you choose to use. Obviously, a website is important. There's a screenshot there from our website for Ocean City Nature. But obviously you're going to need to be thinking about other kind of forms of communication and other channels you might want to use to market and promote the activity which you are running. So that's me. I think I'm going to pass back to Kat now, just to conclude, to wrap up and conclude.
Thank you, Chris. And I really hope that has been super helpful for you in the introduction. But also, if you are slightly bamboozled or shocked by what needs to be done to get, so please don't be put off. It took us quite a little while to get our head around this. And I think if you go back and go through the steps, you'll find it is absolutely totally possible to replicate what we've done, and hopefully with all the information that's been provided, now there's links been provided in the chat, it's definitely possible to do this in other places. And as Chris says, hopefully you'll find that we've stopped you going down rabbit holes we have done, and you'll be able to do this much faster. So just to give a kind of summary of all that information in terms of where we are with our habitat banking, key facts wise, we're looking at 109 hectares, 3 sites, and expected 280 biodiversity units. So, if you've got space in your city, you could have something similar. $500,000 of capital derives 5.3 million of revenue back to PCC. And when you think PCC, think back into the public pocket to deliver sustainable management. It's really important at that point. It's not going to PCC to go anywhere else. It's being ring fenced to drive real benefits on those sites and really up the quality of nature and all the benefits we know that go with it. So, it keeps that benefit really close. And because of the way the endowment works, we're able to have that cover for 35 years, which means we've got a really long-term funding stream to enable that quality to be achieved. And I think anyone who works in this sector, usually 5 years for a project is a win. So 35 is a real game changer. We have assumptions. So we have a 25 to 35k assumed starting price for our units, and there will be a detailed strategy that goes with that relative to that habitat distinctiveness. We've not assumed that we can sell everything, so there is a redundancy rate for both the habitat and land banking units. And we have a sales strategy that mixes those. And I think hopefully what's been shown is our sales strategy is backed up by our supply and demand thinking as well, so that we've been realistic. And all our sales in our model are complete by year 12. So we haven't made some over optimistic assumptions around our sales in terms of they're all going to sell in the first 3 years. We have really set that out and been cautious in how our model comes forward. So key learnings, and it has been a really big learning curve. So I think, it's easy to underestimate that journey in terms of how to unlock all those different ways of doing things. And it isn't just, you've got some legislation, you can make it done. There is a mindset shift, definitely, into really from a council perspective, accepting different risks. So in some ways, not more risks or more difficult risks, but just different risks in terms of this. And it's one of the big wins that we've had with this project is how supportive our colleagues have been, from finance to land and property to planning, in terms of really getting behind us and come alongside us to make this happen. And that is a really important thing. And external services has been required, so legal and tax advice particularly, absolutely essential, but obviously quite time consuming. So do think about starting those early. In terms of stakeholders, having this project sponsor at a really senior level to influence is absolutely key. So when you are sat in front of your corporate management team or your cabinet, you do have someone at a senior enough level to say, I believe in this, I've checked the numbers, it works. And I think finding those key people within your organisation is really significant for us. It was persuading our cabinet member for finance that actually all the numbers worked and we'd been really diligent on our processes. But you do need a wide range of stakeholders from those internal teams to kind of really help reach that investment readiness perspective. And identifying the strengths of different stakeholders. Chris and I and Theo, we never started with finance as our strength. We are growing it, but we've been able to bring in others who have finance as their strength to help with that decision making, help build the business cases. We could bring the enthusiasm and the nature, but we definitely needed someone with the numbers. So go find that person in your organisation, because it all does add up. And I think in terms of building integrity and common purpose, as Chris said, we never wanted this to be a race to the bottom. We wanted it to be a best in class of how you do this. And we also wanted to make sure that on our spaces, because it's urban, that we get a really good and careful balance between allowing public access, because we know how important it is that people can connect with nature, but also being absolutely authentic in delivering our target habitat condition. So you need to make sure those costs are in the model as well, and keep to your principles. So we set ours early, and we've always kept them as a touchstone for all our decision making, and that's been strong through all our decision making processes, and people have really bought into it. And finally, local authorities are really good at doing place-based work. We know what our priorities are, and therefore the BNG projects that we bring in can really align with city strategies. So, you know, you might think, oh, BNG, that's about the environment, but actually it's as much about what we can do with skills and health and well-being. And that is a real selling point when you're talking to senior leaders as well. And this one is just a big thank you. We absolutely would not be here apart from all these people that are on the screen with the support. So firstly, through Future Parks Accelerator and the partners there in terms of the way they work with us to enable us to meet our potential, meet our ambitions, and help us with all the understanding along the way. And the second phase, really from the NEIRF, allowed us to get to that investment readiness point. So it was essential to keep those phases coming. And finally, to Finance Earth, who not only have done all our financial modelling and helped us with that side of it, they've also been incredibly patient teaching a load of environmentalists about the finance systems. And that's been really important, that we've been able to understand that to a level that we can explain it to others. So we really would not have got here on our own. And I'm very thankful for everyone who's helped us, which is why we are so keen to share what we've learned, so that hopefully many of you will now take yourself on this journey, and we will have lots of habitat banks all over the country delivering great things for our people and our places. Back to you, Victoria.
Thanks, Kat, and everybody. We have got a lot of questions to get through, so we will get started. I think I'm going to try and group them a little bit, because there is a sort of a number that are along a similar sorts of themes, or I'm going to try and kind of get the main bit of the question answered by grouping them together anyway. So I'm going to start, if that's all right, with some of the kind of fact-based questions that we've had, and then we'll probably just to kind of get those covered off to help everybody's understanding. So could I start with could somebody clarify the difference between habitat banking and land banking? Who wants to take that one as our first one?
I can take that one, Victoria, thanks. So habitat banking essentially means waiting for the target habitats to reach their maturity stage before selling the BNG unit. So in the case of a grassland unit, this might be 5 or 10 years after you've started your project, the grassland unit becomes mature, and then you can sell it. Land banking essentially means selling your units upfront at the start of your project before they've been verified, before they've reached that target state.
Great, thank you, Sanchi. The next one, we've got a few that are all around price and what actually do you need to factor in to the cost of your units. So I think it'd be really great, maybe this is for you, Chris or Theo, just to give us a rundown of the key things that need to be factored into determining how much a unit would be worth in any particular circumstances, not necessarily taking the scenarios in Plymouth, but just what do people need to factor in, and then how is surplus? How do you estimate how much surplus might be generated? If I could give you those two, that would be great.
Okay, I reckon there's more than two there, but anyway, I won't.
Sorry.
So what's the cost? So I mean, there's the kind of cost versus the kind of potential income raised from unit sales here. So let's start with the cost. So I noticed so relevant to these sites, I think when I described kind of, very briefly earlier, that kind of detailed cost assessment of delivering the habitat management plan on our pilot site. So that's such an important piece of work to really kind of get into that detail. And I think I noticed a couple of comments in the question as well around kind of how you do that in an urban space where potentially you've got other risks or other kind of factors which may kind of will have an interrelationship with kind of your ability to achieve a target habitat. So how we've built that into the cost as well, as much as we possibly can, in terms of kind of providing kind of an uplift to some of the site infrastructure to those sites as well. So obviously to kind of enable people to kind of pass through areas, keeping our habitats as undisturbed as possible, to mitigate that risk. So that's kind of factored into the cost for that full 30-year life period. So not just kind of the capital works, but also the maintenance of any kind of fencing or paths or other aspects which may be on those sites. In terms of then how does that then work up through? We similarly kind of making sure you've got full cost analysis of kind of the work around that. There's the habitat reporting, so there's the independent ecological surveys of the sites. There's requirements through the BNG register to do independent ecological surveys. In the same way we've used independent ecologists to survey the sites to create our baseline to build up our business model. We'll continue to do that. So making sure that there's kind of a verifiable assessment of what's being achieved over time, feed that back through to the biodiversity and game metric, and kind of use that to inform and update our habitat management plan. So those kind of costs, alongside project management costs, kind of all built into that work. What comes out the other end of that, obviously, is kind of your break even. So for all that modelling, you're going to say, well, actually, over this 30-year period, we put some of the kind of high-level figures there in the slides. That we know that that's going to get us to this point. And then the job for us in terms of unit prices is then to kind of, we've got ways of playing with that model to change potential unit prices depending on year of sale. And also then, depending on each case that comes forward, each developer that comes to us for specific requirements, we can then kind of put an offer back to them depending on the habitat distinctiveness, type of habitat they need, kind of how available it is, how much supply we have of that in our habitat bank, and a number of other factors which kind of allow us to then give a kind of a cost proposal back to developers. Does that answer the question or questions? I don't know if Sanchi or Theo, you want to come in any further on either of any of that.
Sanchi or Theo, anything to add further? No? Okay. In that case, then I'm just gonna, this is probably a question for you, Sanchi, I think, just to further explore the bit around how do you set the price for units. To what extent do you, can you just tell us a little bit about to what extent you think supply, demand side actually, and demand, supply and demand factors will come into the actual price you can charge for a unit? Because what we've talked about at the moment, as Chris was saying, is how do you actually establish what will give you enough money for your 30 years plus, but actually what is the amount you can charge, and how does supply and demand affect that? That'd be great.
Thanks, Victoria. Yeah, I think basically what the financial model lets you do, and that's what Chris described, was understand what the break-even price is to actually deliver this over 30 years. And break-even literally means what's the point where you have enough revenues to meet all your costs. After that point, the actual sale price of your unit is dependent on the market, like Victoria said. Here we are talking about creating a market for BNG units. So we're talking about supply and demand happening at a local level, essentially. So lots of different regional markets being created across England, where there might be an oversupply in some markets, there might be more demand in some markets, and that's what's going to decide the price. And I think I alluded to this briefly before as well, that the price for different habitats based on their distinctiveness and the demand for those habitats will also differ. And we've seen this in the statutory credit pricing that DEFRA has released, where habitats with higher distinctiveness are priced higher.
Great, thank you. One more on supply side, and I think this is probably one for you, Kat, which is actually about the risks, how you are positioning the risks when talking to investors, so the people that would be providing the upfront capital rather than the person purchasing the unit or units, or yourselves as the supplier. So have you considered the risk of supply side overvaluing the units, and what happens if that's the case? Are the potential investors aware of the risks, and do they own the risks? Now, for those people that weren't here yesterday, the investor at present is PCC, charging Kat and Chris a healthy interest rate on their investment. But yeah, just tell us a little bit about how you have spoken to your investor, but also plan to speak to future investors about their risk.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point, and anywhere where there's a new market, there's a risk, isn't there? Because we don't know where it's going to land. I think it was one of the reasons that Plymouth City Council were comfortable being the first investor, because actually the do nothing scenario for us was a loss in income each year because we were losing the contributions we would have got through Section 106 usually. So there's always a balance of risk, isn't there, around some of these. I think what we also did, and Theo and Chris have touched on this, is we did look at demand. So, you know, it's good. Planning is always very good at writing plans and looking at pipelines. So looking at your 5-year land supply, looking at what's going to come forward through infrastructure projects. We did a really thorough assessment of what we thought might come forward in the city. Now, the one thing we can't control is where people buy it from. You know, we don't have a monopoly in terms of making people buy from us. And I think that's really important to say. So that's another risk. People could go and buy it elsewhere. Obviously, there is a factor built in. The further away it is, the more it costs. So that is a financial way of trying to drive unit delivery near the impact. But that was a risk that we were very clear about. And I think that's why we had to go through 3 scrutiny sessions, a number of cabinet sessions to really work through all these risks. And then it's balance, isn't it? A balance, the risk of not doing it and potentially losing biodiversity from the city, losing that revenue opportunity from the city, balanced against the statutory legislation. We're a city that's growing. We know we've got a lot of demand that will come through planning over the next couple of years that will require biodiversity units, because they're either tight sites or they can only get 5% on their site and they're going to need that slight offset. So it was a really good, challenging period of time where we had to go through all those to make sure that we were finding the sweet spot within those. I think in terms of the pricing, you know, we've been conservative with how many we think we might sell over what time period. So we're not looking at selling everything in year 1 and making some crazy like, oh, so we're going to be fine. You know, we have really looked at, you know, spreading those sales over the first 12 years. Obviously, if we can sell them in the first year, we'll go and create some more units and it'll be brilliant. But we have been incredibly conservative based on what we know the demand's likely to be. And all that information is available for any place that's got, you know, got a planning department. They'll have a 5-year housing land supply. They'll know what the infrastructure is coming through. So there is no doubt, and we've never said there is no risk in doing this, but I think we have gone through numerous iterations of that kind of diligence of reducing those risks, being very smart about and very precautionary in our finance model so that we give ourselves the best chance of being successful.
Great, thanks, Kat. I'm gonna change topic to be a little bit more focused on people in a second, but I just want to flag up that we have put a poll up for you. We'd really love to know, to get your thoughts on what you think your next steps might be around habitat banking. It'll take you a couple of seconds to answer the question and give us a quick vote. So whilst you're listening to the answers, if you could do that, that would be great. You'll find the poll button along the bottom of your screen. Right, okay, so people and nature questions. We've got a number of questions about how do you manage the access for people and nature. You have, all of you, I think, have touched on this at various points throughout the presentation, but if you could just give a bit of a recap about how do you balance providing access for people with providing habitats. So, and sort of some of the actual things you are doing to be able to make that balance happen in real life, operationally, I suppose. That'd be great. Probably start with you, Chris. Does that feel fair?
That's fair. Yeah. I mean, it's the age-old question: is it if anyone is a conservation manager, kind of a green space, kind of manager, then it's that always that question we're posing ourselves. How can we deliver the highest quality sites, but also kind of providing access to people to be there and access the benefits we know come from being there. So in terms of what we've done here, as I described earlier, we've costed in these. So two of the sites, Hamworth and Cabot, have existing access networks within them, which we've, at different points, with different routes of project funding over the last sort of 10, 15 years, we've invested in. So we've costed in the factor of kind of providing an uplift to elements of that and maintaining that then for that 30-year period. It's very much, the key kind of level of sort of disturbance we considered is obviously just increasing, making something really good. People want to visit it. And that's what we want. That's what we want to happen. We want to generate that social value from these projects. But yeah, we will need to kind of have sort of, in areas we've identified where maybe need for fencing, just to kind of, take people on the path which we sort of want them to go on, to avoid kind of trampling potentially sensitive areas of habitat. We're going to need to factor that in. We've also factored in costs around, actually people being on the site. So kind of operational teams who will be visiting the site on a regular basis to be monitoring and kind of ensuring that kind of what's happening on the site is is managed well. That's absolutely key. It's what we all know kind of we need more of. We need more of those revenues to kind of have people out on the ground, engaging with communities, working with communities. We've got a number of friends groups in the city, including on some of these sites, do a great job of kind of helping us to maintain and manage those sites. But the more effort we can put into kind of working with other people, we build that kind of movement, and we kind of build the eyes and ears and kind of the ability to kind of deliver high quality habitats on those sites. So it's all factored into the costing really of how we built that up.
Great, thank you. Anybody want to add anything further to that one?
I think just the only thing I'd add is, what we're doing is embedding what we're doing with the BNG with all the other work we're doing across the city with green and blue as well. And I think our learning has been over a long period of time that trying to keep people away from nature in a city doesn't work. All you create is really difficult spaces and places. So, in addition to what we will do with the BNG sites, all of our programs that are around engaging communities with spaces and helping them to find the value that they see in those spaces is essential as well. So it becomes kind of part of that place work that we're doing around ensuring people can connect with nature and build that kind of relationship with it, in which case they want to see it thriving and doing well, and will accept when nature needs to have space. So I think that's the key thing is with all of this, is that this BNG work doesn't sit in a bubble separate from all the other work we're doing across the city.
Great, thank you.
Just one more thing which maybe is useful for people to think about, is then when you've got your detailed kind of Habitat UK HAB assessment of the site, you will find there may be distinct parcels of land which you can identify risk around, and it's possible to exclude those from what you're registering. Maybe excluding from the lease. So that's definitely something to consider. Is actually if you've got small parcels of land which you think are, for example, backing onto the backs of private property, etc., which get regular sort of fly tipping, all that kind of thing, you think it's just we're never going to be able to achieve that. You can draw a line around it. You can exclude it from what you're registering with the Net Gain Register. So, and you can exclude that from your calculations as well.
Great, that's really helpful. We've got another couple of questions about actually what is in and outside of your red lines, for want of a better word, actually. So somebody, now I'm trying to find it, has asked whether or not you're putting any of your more amenity land into, or thinking about putting any of your more amenity green space into the Habitat Bank. Pitches, play spaces, etc.
Shall I start, Kat, and then you can follow? I mean, I think it's a really interesting question. I know, you know, I speak to colleagues and peers around the country in sort of similar roles. You know, I know a lot of urban spaces don't have the good fortune that we have in Plymouth, where we've got, you know, kind of over 40% of the city is green space. So, you know, we're in an advantageous position for being able to kind of access these sites at this scale. I fully appreciate that. I know others, people won't necessarily be in that position. So looking at those kind of, amenity sites may be something to be considered. From our point of view, we've got the kind of that pipeline which Theo described in terms of our supply sites. We have got kind of, as part of that pipeline, kind of potentially a range of amenity sites, whereby in Plymouth we've particularly like grassland sites where we're moving from we moved to a kind of 60-40 split in our grass cutting. So we have got quite a supply of kind of over 100 hectares of amenity grassland sites. I think doing that, I think we take the view of this. It's not, if the point are going to be the next, they're not going to be the next ones off the block. I think some of those risks we've talked about play into those amenity space sites kind of a lot more. There'll be a lot of work you need to do in advance of bringing those online, but absolutely, the potential's there. It's just the work you need to do to enable them to kind of be part of that pipeline. And
I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but also it's a little bit about understanding what the demand is going to be. So in terms of what type of habitat is going to need to be created for units as well. So that will be an important factor for local context. Okay, right. We are. Oh, go on. Yes.
Sorry, just it's also worth remembering that BNG isn't the only game in town. So it is one really useful tool in terms of looking at this, but it's not the only green finance, natural capital element that we're looking at in Plymouth, and I'm sure people aren't elsewhere. So, you know, as part of our Ocean City Nature portfolio, as we're calling it, you know, we are looking at SUDs, which will probably have a completely different financial model around it. So, and we're looking at green carbon and blue seagrass tokens. So I think it is worth, if it doesn't fit, don't try and fit a round peg in a square hole, find the other financial model that goes with that. And I think what we're hoping we'll end up with is a whole mix of these across the city, because what we want to do is do the right thing in the right place with the right financial model and the right management. So there is a lot of work we've done on SUDs and carbon and things like that. And I suspect in the future, what we'll find is a real mosaic of different funding models across the city for different habitats and different natural services. So, you know, don't be disheartened if you think, well, BNG is not going to work, green finance isn't going to work for me. It might just be you need to think about a different way of packaging up those natural services that will still give you a really sustainable financial model. It just might not be BNG.
Brilliant, thank you. And you've answered one of the other questions as well, so excellent. And also, if you want to know more about the wider Ocean City Nature structures, then the slides and recordings from yesterday give you a bit more of an insight into that as well. They will be on the Notion site. Well, the slides are already there, and the recordings will be there as soon as we've edited them. So do come back and look at those if that's of interest to you. So can we turn our attention to volunteers and friends of groups and thinking about their role in providing, in undertaking some of the maintenance? Theo, is that a question for you? Yeah, just is that possible? And would you achieve buy-in for that with those groups?
I think this is a combined answer from myself and Chris. I think as Chris touched on earlier, it's absolutely essential having involvement with the local friends groups, because they're very present and they, you know, live locally mostly and are very active on those sites, and kind of building those relationships with them and combining those efforts is a very sought after and very important aspect of it. So you've got the local community, and it also touches on those the social aspects that we discussed earlier. And so it's also about doing, you know, good habitat management for the sites, but it's also about bringing like good mental well-being for these green spaces, and doing combined like volunteer activities with local groups that could work towards biodiversity net gain targets. And that's the best of both worlds, being able to do that. And, you know, and it bring those benefits, and it just requires that, you know, extra attention to detail when coordinating those activities. And so that kind of part of it, the biodiversity net gain, as Kat was saying earlier, that's like the financial tool. But what needs to be in place is that kind of the right team to deliver it. That is, you know, good working with local volunteer groups, coordinating them as such, and, you know, hitting those targets, but also maintaining the site for its best optimum biodiversity value. If you want to add anything there, Chris, or?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you've yeah, put that really well. I think in terms of the activity, the value we've got with our volunteer groups and people who kind of input into that, yeah, there's a myriad of expertise that kind of comes in to play, and yeah, the important ability, you know, probably all have this challenge is how do we support that? How do we enable that to happen in a way, you know, which kind of is meaningful and kind of all works towards that common purpose. So we know that having people on the ground to kind of enable that is absolutely key. So this is where these revenue streams will kind of really enable us to sort of work in that direction further.
And I think just on top of that as well, with, you know, it's 30 years, which is great, and it means that it's there to help facilitate if it can, those groups. Whereas, you know, groups can come and go based on how they're structured, how many members they have, and so kind of help with that and give it the legacy so they can carry on there as well.
Great, thank you. I'm gonna change topic and just ask this, probably Bethan and Sanchi, a couple of questions less about the Plymouth experience. So I've got a question here about who can offer land as Habitat Bank and who might enter the market to sell units. But then secondly, there was another one that was around just about the legal structures, and so it would just be useful if you could just answer the question, but then also just give us a quick insight into some of the contents of the resources in terms of setting out the different options, not to go into the options, but different options. So Plymouth City Council have taken one approach to setting up Habitat Bank. It's not the only one, there are others. So if you could just give us a little insight there, that would be great. Sanchi, do you want to go first?
Thanks, Victoria. So who can offer land into the register and sell BNG units? Essentially, either a landowner or someone who can establish that they have a long-term lease over the land can do so with agreement with the landowner, of course. So you need to just have that necessary agreement and contract in place. That's what Natural England, when they're doing their due diligence during site registration, will look for. And if you're able to provide that agreement with the landowner, then you should be able to supply BNG units. It's really as simple as that, and anyone can do it if they have that in place. On legal structures, obviously what we explored today with Plymouth is one option, but as Chris and Kat pointed out, during those 3 cabinet processes, we did go through a range of options, and you know, perhaps for your local authority, the option could look very different, and those options are outlined in the resources, and I'll point to Bethan to cover those.
Yeah, thanks, Sanchi. So not much to add other than, you know, we have been exploring habitat banking with charitable organisations, third sector organisations as well, parts foundations involved as well. Also looking at who might get involved in site management contracts, like wildlife trusts as well, that sort of thing. But also in terms of legal and governance structures, we've worked through about 5 or 6 different options with different places. So we do give examples and nice flow charts of different models that you might want to try and get your heads around, and then apply it to your place and see what works.
Great, thanks, Bethan. I'm going to keep us going with questions because we've got a lot. There's probably more than we're going to get to, but for those we don't, well, for all of the questions, both from yesterday and today, we will make sure we've got a written answer to everything, even the ones we've answered verbally, and that will be published on the Notion website. But could we just turn to the Habitat Bank and staffing? So we've got a couple of questions around does Ocean City Nature employ its own staff, or are they PCC staff, and how does that work? And questions along that theme. But I think if we could start there, that would probably help answer those ones.
Shall I start, Chris, with the kind of setup? Because I think one of the things that is really important is this transparency of how the decision making is made as well. I think Wendy went through really importantly how there is differentiations between OCN and Plymouth City Council, because obviously the council needs to take its own review of risk. So the way we've got it set up at the minute is the directors are from Plymouth City Council, and that's being expanded. But those directors have a legal duty to the companies. So it's really important that that's clear. So I am one of the OCN directors, as is my director, and a different director from the local authority is the director on OCB. So there's a real distinction between those versus the member rep in Plymouth City Council that makes decisions on behalf of the council. So all councils are used to dealing with probity because we're always often landowners and local planning authorities. So we're really good at that. And we followed that very strict way of doing it, that probity in terms of the way we've set these companies up. It would be lovely when we've got enough resource, because we've sold loads of units and masses of carbon and there's loads of social impacts, that we would get to a point where we might be able to appoint staff to work on this all full time and have a whole fleet of people. But at the moment, in terms of the employment is with Plymouth City Council, and I saw the question, we are not changing job titles currently, but there is a clear line of decision making that ensures officers that are working either on OCN and OCB to help in that development, or those that are delivering the land management agreements. There's some very clear rules put up through probity to make sure that decision making is really clear. And I think it's one that we'll watch and review as things evolve. So if the natural capital market takes off and we've got 5 sub-funds running, then we might be in a different position. But at this early stage when we're testing the market, OCN and OCB are basically buying resource from Plymouth City Council officers to enable that to happen. Chris, do you want to add a bit more flavour to that?
Yeah, I think you kind of illustrated it really well. But yeah, in terms of the reality of what that involves, yes, of the ecological expertise, the kind of people managing the habitat managers on the sites themselves. There's also the sort of external services that go around that as well. So yeah, it was part of our conversation. We were building the business case up. Within a local authority, our core support services are under severe pressure just due to kind of lack of capacity. So we have kind of certain elements of this we've chosen to outsource just to make sure that we don't kind of create too much pressure internally in terms of making sure we kind of achieve what we need to do to kind of be a company in terms of our reporting, kind of our accounting, etc. So we have chosen to outsource a few functions. And then again, that also gives a bit of a clear distinction from the company to then kind of our own kind of internal technical accounting team as well, so that we kind of again have a sort of separation there to ensure this all being done above board.
Great, thank you. Just going to ask some habitat questions now, I think. So we've got a range of habitat related questions. One about whether further down the line you're thinking about any wetland or marine type habitats, whether they could be units could be created in those habitats. And then one about cross boundary offsetting, and will the Habitat Bank buy and sell units, well, probably just sell units across local authority boundaries, and if so, how would that work, and how would the monitoring work with other local authorities? And have you found so far, and this might be a one where you actually need to cast a little bit ahead, but a conflict between the types of habitat you as a council would wish to create versus those that bring in a better financial return. And then there was also one about the local nature reserve as well. No, sorry, local nature recovery strategy. So did you have to think about how habitat enhancements delivered through new habitat management and maintenance plans would be additional to any existing management objectives in the local nature recovery strategy? And how did you manage that? That's definitely at least 4 questions, but I think there's an overlap in them. So in the interest of trying to get through as many as possible, it would be wonderful to have some thoughts on some or all of those questions.
I should have written them all down. So I think wetlands definitely, and that aligns with our SUDS programs as well, at water management. So I think we will start looking at those early. Definitely marine, or Ocean City. It would be bonkers not to. I think there's a bit of catching up on the national guidance to allow us to do that, but we have started looking at it, and Sanchi has been really supporting us on our seagrass tokens and how you create that. And so there is, as usual, unfortunately, marine is slightly behind terrestrial, but we are determined to catch it up. So that's a definite yes on those 2. I don't know, Chris, you wanted to cover some of the points on the management plans?
Yeah, so I think the question was around, kind of the additionality, kind of a management plan. So in terms of the interplay with the local nature recovery strategy, so our kind of baseline, our guiding kind of guidance comes from our UK HAB surveys, which feed into the Deframetric, which kind of form updates to the habitat management plan. So there's no kind of consideration we're having to like knock anything out to say we're already required to do that on this site. I know there's been a bit of conversation nationally around kind of if there's whether you eligibility for sites, for example, for particular designations. We're kind of working well both on a local kind of aspect, but also Devon level on a local nature recovery strategy. So all this kind of information we've got is feeding into that development of that strategy to make sure that they kind of work well with each other. I think the other question was on cross-boundary, wasn't it? I mean, in terms of provision of that element, it's not something which we're, currently working on, but certainly we're kind of, work well in partnership with our neighbouring local authorities. We've got a joint local plan with them. So in the development of the local nature recovery strategy, I think there's work to do for us to look at kind of how the work we're doing in Plymouth potentially complements and works with some of our neighbours to kind of get some really effective and efficient delivery, not only kind of on the ground and sort of from a financial sense, but also from that kind of concept of delivering kind of Norton principles at scale and making sure we're achieving the objectives of those local nature recovery strategies. So I think kind of it's quite a dynamic time, isn't it? We're kind of like all kind of working out how all these things kind of fit together, and I think over the course of the next 12 months, 2 years, we're kind of going to start to see some of those pieces of the jigsaw sort of fall into place. But I think there's still a few unknowns here, which we're working with at the minute.
Marvellous, very gallant attempt from all of you to answer my 4 questions in one.
I may have some additional for that, Victoria. Just I think on the wetland is quite important for this. Is going into different types of units, which is really it's a really interesting aspect of biodiversity net gain, and it's where you've got 3 different types of units: sewer, area, linear, and then basically river watercourse units. And that's when you triggered when a developer is within 10 meters of the kind of riparian zone with their red line boundary. And so you need to see that influx of by that kind of vein, the river units, which is generated from the river condition assessment survey. And that is what will definitely influence how the riparian zones and those watercourses can be improved, but it needs that aspect of it. And developers, they know that it's very expensive, and so they're going to try and do their best to avoid triggering the RCA, the River Condition Assessment Survey. And then also, I think there's a question on, what habitats. I think for these sites, it's all about maintaining what's there. So it's not really like a habitat. It's about doing best habitat management practice. It's not about that kind of monetary side of it. It's what is best ecologically for the site. So, if there's a good grassland pastoral, it's maintaining that and enhancing it if it's required. So really critical. And then as Chris is saying there, is then goes into that kind of, you're making your core habitats more robust and resilient, and kind of filters into creating and delivering the local nature recovery strategy. So just those points are really critical. It's got to be best for those green spaces. And that's what we strive to do, following the kind of golden kind of principles there.
Brilliant. Thank you. We are out of time, unfortunately. We haven't quite managed to get through all of the questions, but as I said, we will get answers to those and put them up on to the Notion site. Some really good questions there. Panel, any last thoughts that you're desperate to get across before we close? Anything you just wanted to finish up with? Bethan?
Yeah, just on that last point about the cross-boundary work, it just made me think what we haven't touched on, because Plymouth's so lucky in a way that they've got this amazing pipeline coming through. For those on the call who are from authorities, that actually when you look at it, it may be that it's not viable, that that a habitat bank wouldn't work. So just really to flag, that there are those models where you can scale up and aggregate with neighbouring authorities and go into this journey together with friends as well. So there is the Greater Manchester combined authority approach, but we're aware of people at district level also looking to pair up or go into this as a gang. So just wanted to flag that too.
Great. I think, unless anybody, Kat.
I think there was a really good question yesterday around why local authorities doing it, and I think the best answer that our cabinet went, why not? So all I would just say is I think it is a hugely powerful tool. Might be used in different ways. You might need to buddy up with your partners, you might mix it into other things, you might not do it quite the way we did it, but I think in terms of the opportunity for the public sector to gain huge benefits for people, places and nature out of this programme, I'd say even if you're even a little bit interested, then please look into it a bit further, because I think it could really revolutionise what our spaces look like across the next 30 years in a otherwise quite bleak financial outlook. So I think it is really worth having a look if you've got any interest at all.
Brilliant, thank you. Some hope on the horizon, much like the picture behind you. So we'll leave it there. Thank you, PCC, Finance Earth, National Trust colleagues for presenting today. Thank you everybody who's logged on and joined in, answered questions, listened, taken copious notes. We really appreciate your interest in this. There's a huge number of thanks to people that have helped participate in creating and producing the resources that you'll be able to access, and to our production partners, Iris and Birch as well. Obviously, one more thank you to Natural England, who have made today's webinar and yesterday's webinar happen. And yeah, please do take a look at the resources and share the slides and videos from today and yesterday with your peers. And we'd love to hear from you if you really are thinking about this. So do fill in the poll and get in touch, in particular with the Future Parks team on info@futureparks.org.uk if this is something you're really seriously considering. So yeah, thank you very much, and we'll see you all soon.